1888, only 9 years later, it wasn't just a national reform. There was 3 other organizations that joined. And this was a powerful, what had started out as a grassroots movement that had covered the entire country, where these groups were joined together to bring about a change in our country, to Christianize it. Again, they had legitimate reasons, but it's the way they were going about it. And we've already talked about the Blair Bill on May 21. It was a national Sunday law. Notice why they wanted to do it. It was a national Sunday law is needed to make the state laws complete and effective. That's all they were doing. But there was another bill on the 25th, 4 days later. Blair wanted to introduce this bill, and that was an amendment to the Constitution. And the idea in this was to establish the Christian religion as a religion of the nation, and this to the exclusion of all other religions. Do you see how quickly what the founders of this country had instituted would have changed if this had gone through? And all of this set the context then, or the background to what Ellen White would title or call the most important meeting. Think about this. A general conference when all the leadership of this church would gather to then go out to the membership and share what God was intending to do at this conference. And Ellen White, based on some dreams she had that summer, had this to say when she wrote to the brethren in the summer of 1888. She said, "We are impressed that this gathering will be the most important meeting you have ever attended. All selfish ambition should be laid aside, and you should plead with God for His Spirit to descend upon you as it came upon the disciples who were assembled together on the day of Pentecost." That is latter rain language. And I believe with all my heart that God not only intended, but He began to pour out the Holy Spirit in Minneapolis and following, because He wanted to prepare this people for what was coming on the earth. Well, what about the presentation at Minneapolis? Now, I have, like I said, spent probably 25 years writing and speaking more recently on the topic of righteousness by faith or justification in a history setting, not so much theologically, but just talking about how this was a message that came. But it's only recently that I realized that liberty of conscience was at the very foundation of that meeting that took place. Now, I realize I'm late to the game. Maybe all of you already understood this, but I will show you a few slides here of why I finally come to this conclusion recently as I've been reading books on liberty of conscience. This is W.C. Wright writing about 2 years after the conference to Dan Jones, the General Conference Secretary, and he's telling him, the plans for the Minneapolis Conference. And he says, early in 1888, I began corresponding with Elder Butler, General Conference President, about the institute to precede the Minneapolis Conference. I proposed 4 or 5 lines of work, among which were the duties of church officers, new advanced measures for carrying the message, the study of Bible doctrines, and then notice, included in that list, our religious liberty work, and 1 or 2 other lines I can't recall. So even here is evidence that the plan was, even before the conference, that liberty of conscience would be a subject talked about at Minneapolis. Well, DeWitt Hottle, he was one of the delegates that went to the conference, and he wrote notes. Unfortunately, they're very short. But he also indicates another indication that there were, in fact, I read this. This is one of the earliest things I read about 8 months ago. And I said, I can't believe this. They actually were talking about this at Minneapolis. In his note for October 18, he says, Elder Jones gave an excellent talk on national reform. And by the way, the word national reform is a catchphrase for the whole religious liberty, liberty of conscience issues that were happening at that very time. Unfortunately, that's all he wrote. 10 days later, he writes, Brother Jones spoke on the national reform tonight. So we know that at least twice Jones presented. Now what happened was Brother Hottle got sick for 10 days, which he talks about, so he missed all the meetings. But we know that at least twice Jones presented at Minneapolis on the topic of liberty of conscience or religious liberty in regard to national reform. Well, again, about 8 months ago, I have a book on my shelf, not this new cover, called Civil Government and Religion. It's been sitting there for decades, and I decided, I have never read that. I need to read it. So I pulled it off the shelf, and I opened to the preface, because I figured that's where I should start. And to my astonishment, this is what is stated there. This little work is the outgrowth of several lectures upon the relationship between religion and the civil power delivered in Minneapolis, Minnesota in October 1888. He's talking about at the General Conference in this little work of 168 pages for Jones. The interest manifested in this subject and numerous requests for the publication of the main points of the arguments presented have led to the issuing of this pamphlet. So this is literally some of what was presented in Minneapolis, and I had been totally unaware of that. By the way, Jonathan Zirkle and Ron Knott's talk this morning shows you some of the arguments Jones gave in Washington, D.C., come right out of this book. And that obviously was part of what was presented in Minneapolis. Well, there's another letter that I was familiar with, but somehow had missed this. It's a letter written by A.T. Jones 2 years before he passed away to a brother Holmes, and he's talking about Minneapolis. He says, Sister White stood out openly and strongly all the way for righteousness by faith. And then he continues, and it was given the greater force by the message of religious liberty. At Minneapolis. Righteousness by faith at Minneapolis was given greater force because it was presented in the context of liberty of conscience. Then, he continues, then when camp meetings time came, 1889, we all three, Jones, Wagner, and Ellen White, visited the camp meetings with the message of righteousness by faith and religious liberty. Sometimes all three of us being in the same meeting, this turned the tide with the people. And I have spent many a presentation talking about the revivals that resulted during 1889 as a result of the preaching of righteousness by faith. But I have never included the thought that it actually was based on and included with the talk on liberty of conscience.